Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into the financial forces that really shaped the 2004 U.S. presidential election, the one between George W. Bush and John Kerry.
That's right.
We've assembled a, really compelling set of sources here, everything from detailed analyses of campaign spending and official FEC data to expert insights and some fascinating academic research.
Yeah, quite a stack.
Our goal, to understand where the massive amounts of money in this election originated, where it was directed, and ultimately, I guess, the pivotal role it played in this contest. And this election was a real turning point financially. I mean, the very first under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BCRA. So get ready, because there's a lot to unpack and understand about how this new legislation impacted campaign finance.
Absolutely. This deep dive isn't just about the candidates and their platforms. It's also a crucial look at a moment of, significant change in how American elections are funded. The sources we're examining really illuminate a system undergoing a major transformation.
Right. Now, just to give you the lay of the land, the key issues dominating the campaign were really intense. National security was a huge concern. The Iraq War was obviously a major point of debate.
Front center.
And then you had the ongoing discussions around the economy, healthcare, and those perennial social issues. It was a nail-biter of a race, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Very close.
Bush ultimately won with 50.7% of the popular vote, securing 286 electoral votes. Kerry was very close behind with 48.3% and 251 electoral votes. And if you remember, all eyes were on Ohio as the state that ultimately, determined the outcome for Bush. What's also remarkable is that voter turnout hit a high of 60.1% people were definitely invested.
That level of engagement from voters really highlights the high stakes of the election. And as our sources clearly show, the financial dimension of the campaign was equally significant.
You're absolutely right. The numbers are staggering. We're talking about over $1 billion combined spent by the presidential candidates and their national party convention.
$1 billion. Wow.
That's a 56% increase compared to the 2000 election. Here's where it gets really interesting. As we mentioned, this was the first election under BCRA, which famously put an end to national party soft money.
Right. That was the big change.
And what sprang up in its place, the significant rise of these 527 organizations that we're going to explore in detail. Plus, both Bush and Kerry made a significant early decision. They chose not to accept public matching funds for their primary campaigns. It all points to a fundamental shift in how presidential campaigns were financed in this cycle. So if BCRA was intended to curb the influence of big money, it certainly led to some unexpected changes in where that money flowed.
That's a critical point. The decision to forego primary public funds really set the stage for the unprecedented levels of private fundraising we then witnessed. It kind of opened the floodgates, allowing for unlimited fundraising within individual contribution limits, of course, during the nomination contests.
Okay, let's dig deeper into the financial details, starting with the general election. Now, despite that primary fundraising free-for-all, both Bush and Kerry did decide to accept federal public financing for the general election campaign. We're talking about $74.6 million each, a substantial amount of taxpayer money, right?
It was a considerable sum, indeed, funded through those voluntary tax checkoffs. However, accepting these funds came with important conditions. Most notably, a strict $74.6 million spending limit for the entire general election period.
Right, hard cap.
And a prohibition on raising additional private funds specifically for campaign activities. There was a very limited exception for covering legal and accounting expenses, but the core campaign spending was firmly capped.
Which creates a fascinating strategic puzzle, doesn't it? They both turned down public funds with spending limits during the primaries, but then embraced them for the general election. What was the thinking there? It seems a bit paradoxical at first glance.
Well, what's fascinating here is the strategic calculation involved. In the primaries, without those spending limits, the ability to aggressively raise and spend money was seen as essential for building early momentum, gaining an edge over potentially crowded fields.
Okay. Makes sense for the primaries.
But by the time the general election rolled around, the contest was a head-to-head race. That $74.6 million in public funds offered a guaranteed and substantial financial base for the final push.
Guaranteed cash.
Exactly. And it also created a degree of financial parity between the two main campaigns for their core operations. You could argue there was a desire for a more level playing field, at least in terms of direct campaign funds.
Right, okay.
Of course, as we'll discuss, other avenues of spending significantly complicated that picture of parity. And it's interesting to note that in subsequent elections, the perceived value of these general election funds diminished further, leading to some nominees rejecting them entirely.
Right, the financial strategies just keep evolving. Okay, now this is where things get particularly interesting and maybe a little controversial. Let's talk about the Bush-Cheney campaign's FEC audit. Apparently, there were questions raised about $81.4 million in hybrid advertisements that were jointly funded with the Republican National Committee. The cost was split right down the middle.
Yeah, 50-50.
These ads featured Bush prominently, but they also included mentions of the Republican Party. So what exactly was the issue that caught the FEC's attention?
The central issue, according to the FEC auditors, was the argument that the RNC's $40.7 million share of the cost, along with an additional $1.7 million in commissions, essentially constituted an undeclared and impermissible in-kind contribution directly to the Bush campaign.
Okay.
Their reasoning was that these advertisements primarily benefited Bush's candidacy and therefore should have been counted against his $74.6 million general election spending limit. If the FEC had agreed with this assessment, the Bush campaign would have significantly exceeded its legal spending cap.
Okay, so the FEC auditors were essentially saying, wait a minute, this looks like the RNC is trying to pump extra money into the Bush campaign while sidestepping the spending limits by calling it party building. Is that kind of right?
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
But what was the Bush campaign and the RNC's response to these concerns?
Well, their primary argument was that these were permissible cost-sharing arrangements for legitimate party-building activities, as defined under existing FEC rules and interpretations. They maintained that because the advertisements also included references to the Republican Party, they served a broader purpose of promoting the party as a whole, not solely the election of George W. Bush.
And what was the final decision from the FEC on this potentially significant overspending? Did they find the Bush campaign in violation?
Here's where it gets really intriguing. The FEC commissioners actually reached a 3-3 deadlock on whether this spending constituted a violation of campaign finance law.
A tie.
So because there wasn't a majority vote in either direction, no formal violation was found, and the Bush campaign was not required to repay any of the funds.
Wow.
However, it's crucial to understand that the 3 dissenting commissioners firmly believed that this was an illegal contribution, so it was far from a unanimous agreement within the regulatory body. This situation really highlights the complexities and, well, often partisan nature of campaign finance enforcement.
So a split decision essentially allowed them to avoid any penalties, even though half the FEC thought it was problematic. That certainly raises some questions about enforcement. Now, it wasn't just the Republicans engaging in this kind of jointly funded advertising, was it? It sounds like Kerry and the Democratic National Committee were also involved, although perhaps on a smaller scale.
That's correct. While the Bush RNC situation drew the most scrutiny due to the substantial amount of money involved, the Kerry campaign and the DNC also engaged in similar, though less extensive, hybrid or generic party advertising. The DNC reported spending $24 million on such ads, and the RNC's total reported spending in this category, including their share of the Bush ads, was $45.8 million. This suggests that both parties were exploring these avenues, but the scale of the RNC's activity was significantly larger.
And we should also touch on coordinated expenditures, right? That's another way the parties could help out. What were the rules governing those?
Right. Coordinated expenditures were a specific category of limited spending that the national parties could undertake in close coordination with their presidential campaigns. These expenditures were typically for things like polling, producing targeted ads, or campaign strategy.
Okay.
For the 2004 election cycle, each national party was legally allowed to spend up to $16.25 million in coordinated expenditures on behalf of their presidential ticket, for a total potential of $32.5 million across both parties.
Okay, so let's step back and look at the big picture of general election finances then. It seems that while the campaigns themselves had roughly equal direct spending because of the public financing,
on paper,
the Republican Party, through its significantly higher spending on these ads that benefited Bush, may have created a considerable overall financial advantage for the Republican side during those crucial final months of the campaign.
That's a very insightful summary. While the public funding system aimed to create a level playing field for the candidates' direct campaign spending in the general election, the RNC's ability to spend substantially more on advertising that directly featured and benefited Bush suggests a potential and significant overall financial edge for the Republican effort during that critical period.
Right. Okay, now let's zoom out even further and consider the total financial picture for the entire 2004 election cycle, including those often really expensive primary contests. We've already mentioned that both Bush and Kerry chose to forego primary public matching funds, which led to this massive influx of private donations. Bush, benefiting from his position as the incumbent president, apparently built up a huge early fundraising advantage, something like $269.6 million raised before the national convention.
Yeah, his status as the sitting president gave him a tremendous advantage in fundraising. Without facing a serious primary challenge, he could focus all his financial efforts on amassing a substantial war chest for the general election. His well-established networks of high-dollar donors and bundlers, the ones known as rangers and pioneers, proved incredibly effective in securing those large individual contributions.
And Kerry, despite having to navigate a competitive Democratic primary field, also managed to raise a record-breaking $234.6 million before the convention. That's a significant jump compared to previous Democratic nominees who'd taken public funding for their primaries.
It really is.
It really underscores how the higher individual contribution limits under BCRA became crucial. It's interesting that you mentioned Howard Dean, who's kind of pioneering that internet-based small-dollar fundraising model. Quite a contrast to the traditional big money approach, wasn't it?
Dean's innovative online fundraising efforts were certainly a sign of things to come and garnered a lot of attention. However, in the 2004 cycle, while it was noteworthy, the vast majority of the really big money that fueled both the Bush and Kerry campaigns still came from those larger individual contributions that both campaigns actively pursued. BCRA's changes to the individual contribution limits made that a particularly important fundraising strategy for both sides.
Okay, so let's look at the final accounting for the entire election cycle. We have data here showing the total amounts raised and spent. Let's see, Bush raised $367.2 million and spent $345.3 million. Remarkably, 74% of that came from individual donors. That's $271.8 million. And then he also received the $74.6 million in public funds. Yeah. He ultimately ranked first in total spending. Kerry raised $328.5 million and spent $309.7 million, with 69.1% coming from individual contributions, $227 million. And he also received the $74.6 million in public funds. He ranked second in total spending. So the numbers clearly show that Bush outspent Kerry overall across the entire election.
That's a significant financial difference over the entire election cycle. Bush outspent Kerry by approximately $35.6 million. This advantage likely stemmed from his inherent fundraising power as the incumbent president facing no significant primary challenge, which allowed him to accumulate more resources earlier and maintain a higher level of spending throughout the entire campaign.
Now let's turn our attention to what many observers felt was a real game changer in the 2004 election: the significant rise in influence of these 527 organizations.
Ah, yes, the 527s.
We touched on this earlier, mentioning that BCRA's ban on party soft money seemed to create an opening for these groups. Can you elaborate on that idea, the so-called hydraulic theory of campaign finance?
Right. The hydraulic theory offers a compelling way to understand what happened. It basically suggests that money seeking to influence politics is like water. If you block one channel, it will inevitably find another way to flow. BCRA effectively dammed up the flow of large, unregulated soft money contributions to the national political parties. However, the desire of wealthy individuals, corporations, and labor unions to spend substantial sums to influence federal elections didn't simply disappear. So this money sought out new avenues.
And found the 527s.
Exactly. 527 organizations, which were already in existence under Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code, but hadn't been major political players previously, rapidly expanded to become those new conduits. They could raise and spend large amounts of money, ostensibly for issue advocacy, often without facing the same contribution limits and source restrictions as traditional political committees that directly advocate for or against candidates.
Right. Their argument was that they weren't explicitly telling people who to vote for. They were just educating the public about important issues, even if those issues clearly aligned with one candidate's platform over the others. It sounds like a very fine and often blurred legal line.
Precisely. The distinction between genuine issue advocacy and what was essentially thinly veiled express advocacy directly urging the election or defeat of a candidate was often incredibly difficult to determine in practice. Many of these 527 groups ran very direct and often highly critical advertisements targeting specific candidates, leading to significant legal and political controversy over whether they should be subject to the same regulatory requirements as traditional political committees.
So, who are some of the most significant players on the pro-Kerry anti-Bush side when it came to these 527s? We recall hearing a lot about George Soros' substantial contributions back then.
Oh, yes. On the pro-Kerry side, some of the most prominent and well-funded groups included America Coming Together, or ACT. They focused heavily on voter registration drives and get-out-the-vote efforts and raised a substantial sum, around $137 million.
Wow, $137 million just for GOTV, basically.
Well, and registration. Then there was the MoveOn.org Voter Fund, which became well known for its hard-hitting anti-Bush television advertisements, spending over $21 million. The Media Fund was another major player in running anti-Bush ads, with estimated spending exceeding $59 million.
So lots of anti-Bush ads.
Definitely. We also saw significant financial activity from 527 groups funded by labor unions, with estimated total pro-Democrat spending from these entities reaching approximately $94 million. And yes, major individual donors like George Soros, who contributed over $23 million, and Peter Lewis played very significant roles in providing the financial backing for many of these organizations.
And what about the pro-Bushanti Kerry 527s? The Swift Boat Veterans for Truth certainly generated a lot of media attention, maybe more than any other.
The Swift Boat Veterans and POWs for Truth were undoubtedly the most talked about on the pro-Bush side, largely due to the intense controversy surrounding their advertisements that attacked John Kerry's Vietnam War record. They spent around $22.6 million.
Right, I remember those ads. Yeah. Very controversial.
Another key group supporting Bush was Progress for America Voter Fund, which engaged in advertising and voter mobilization efforts, with estimated spending also in the range of $35 million or more. Major individual donors to these types of groups included individuals like Bob J. Perry, Alex Spanos, and T. Boone Pickens.
So what was the estimated total amount of money spent by all these 527 organizations combined in the 2004 cycle? It sounds like it became a really significant part of the overall financial picture.
Estimates generally place the total spending by 527 organizations somewhere between $405 million and $435 million.
400 million plus.
Yeah.
Just from these groups.
Yes, an enormous sum of money, representing a very substantial portion of the total spending in the 2004 election.
And if we look at the data compiled by organizations like Open Secrets on outside spending, which would cover 527s and maybe other independent groups, what does that tell us about which side had the overall advantage in this type of spending?
According to their data, the total outside spending that mentioned George W. Bush amounted to approximately $165.6 million. But a significant majority of that, around $93.7 million, was actually spent against him.
Okay, so more anti-Bush money.
Right. For John Kerry, the total outside spending mentioning him was about $131 million, with the vast majority of that, roughly $99.7 million, spent in support of his candidacy.
So more pro-Kerry money there.
Exactly. This really highlights the fact that, in aggregate, the pro-Kerry and anti-Bush independent groups outspent their pro-Bush and anti-Kerry counterparts.
But, even though the pro-Kerry group spent more overall, that Swift Boat Veterans campaign seemed to have a really outsized impact, almost disproportionate to its relatively smaller budget compared to some of the others. It really underscores the point that it's not solely about how much money is spent, but the effectiveness and resonance of the message, doesn't it? That particular campaign seemed to deeply affect many voters' perceptions of Kerry.
That's a crucial observation. The Swift Boat Veterans campaign, despite not having the largest budget, demonstrated the significant power of a well-targeted and emotionally resonant message, even if it's a negative one. It arguably inflicted considerable damage on John Kerry's image and the narrative of his campaign. This clearly illustrates that the impact of campaign spending isn't always directly correlated with the sheer volume of money spent.
Now, we have some information here about post-election FEC settlements with several of these key 527 groups, including ACT, Swift Vets, MoveOn, and the League of Conservation Voters. What's the story behind these settlements? It suggests that the regulatory framework was kind of struggling to effectively oversee these groups in real time during the election.
You're absolutely right. The FEC faced a very significant challenge in effectively regulating these 527 organizations during the intense 2004 election cycle. There were numerous complex legal questions surrounding whether these groups should be officially classified as political committees and therefore subject to stricter regulations regarding their funding and activities.
Right, that blurred line again.
Exactly. This often led to partisan deadlocks and inaction within the FEC. It wasn't until well after the election that the agency reached settlements with several of the major 527s. These settlements involved financial penalties ranging from $150,000 for move-on up to $775,000 for ACT.
Quite a range.
For various violations, primarily related to issues like proper registration, timely reporting of their financial activities, and adherence to contribution limits. The fact that these enforcement actions came so long after the election itself really underscores the regulatory lag and the difficulties inherent in applying and enforcing campaign finance rules in a rapidly evolving financial and political landscape.
Okay, so now for the really central question.
Yeah.
Did all this money ultimately buy the 2004 presidency? We've seen that Bush's campaign had a direct spending advantage over Kerry's, and the Republican Party likely had a greater overall financial footprint in the general election thanks to those hybrid ads. This seems to align with the conventional wisdom that the candidate who spends more often wins. However, when we factor in the substantial spending by pro-Kerry 527 groups, it appears the Democrats might have had an overall financial edge in terms of independent expenditures. It's a bit of a contradiction.
It is a remarkably complex picture. While George W. Bush's campaign did outspend John Kerry's directly, the total financial landscape of the election, when you include the significant independent spending by these 527 organizations, strongly suggests that the forces generally aligned with Kerry likely had access to and spent more aggregate resources.
Right.
This immediately challenges the simplistic notion that the candidate with the highest campaign spending automatically wins.
So what do the experts and academic researchers generally conclude about the impacts of campaign spending, particularly in a high-profile presidential race like this one? Is there any broad consensus on how much influence all this money really has on the final outcome?
Well, the academic research on the precise impact of campaign spending on election results is actually quite diverse and doesn't point to a single universally accepted conclusion. Some studies suggest that campaign spending, particularly by candidates who are challenging an incumbent, can have a significant influence on voter turnout and can help to raise their profile and disseminate their message.
Okay, so maybe more impact for challengers.
Possibly. However, other research has found only a limited significant impact, especially when it comes to the spending by incumbent candidates. In the context of the 2004 election, many experts at the time believed that the 527 organizations did exert a considerable influence, with the Swiftboat Veterans ads often cited as a prime example of how even a relatively focused amount of spending, if strategically targeted and highly impactful, can shape the overall narrative of a campaign.
Right, so it's not just about the total number of dollars spent, but also about the message being conveyed and how effectively it resonates with voters. We also have to consider those electoral fundamentals that are often discussed, right? Like the state of the economy and the incumbents' approval ratings. Reportedly, those factors were somewhat favorable to Bush in 2004.
Slightly favorable.
So perhaps campaign spending operates more on the margins, potentially swaying a close election, but not necessarily able to overcome strong underlying political trends.
Precisely. Factors like the overall health of the economy, the incumbent president's approval ratings, and whether the incumbent party is seeking a first or second term in office are often seen as very powerful indicators or fundamentals that can significantly influence presidential election outcomes.
Set the stage, kind of.
Exactly. Campaign spending and the various activities it funds can then either amplify or perhaps slightly alter these underlying dynamics. In the 2004 election, the intense focus on national security and the ongoing Iraq War, along with cultural and values issues that mobilized significant segments of the electorate, and the Republican Party's notably effective get-out-the-vote operation.
Their ground game.
Their ground game, yes, were also highlighted by many analysts as key non-financial factors that likely played a substantial role in the final result. The relatively close partisan division within the electorate at the time also suggests that a simple disparity in financial resources alone was unlikely to be the sole determining factor.
So to bring it all together, did money buy the 2004 presidency?
Yeah.
It sounds like the most accurate answer is a very nuanced, not entirely, or maybe it's complicated.
That sounds about right.
While Bush's campaign did outspend Kerry's directly, the overall financial picture, when we include the significant spending by the 527 organizations, seems to indicate a potential aggregate advantage for the pro-Kerry side. The final outcome of the election appears to have been the result of a complex interplay of numerous factors, with campaign finance being a critical piece of that puzzle, but certainly not the only determinant.
That's a very well-stated conclusion. The 2004 election really serves as a fascinating case study in campaign finance, clearly illustrating that simply looking at which campaign or party spent the most money isn't sufficient to fully understand the dynamics and outcome of a national election. The sources of the funds, how they were strategically deployed, the messages they conveyed, and the broader political environment all contribute significantly to the final resume.
Okay, so as we conclude this deep dive, here's a thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given the massive amounts of money that were spent in the closely contested 2004 election, and considering the ultimate outcome, what specific types of spending or which particular messages do you think ultimately had the most decisive impact on voters?
Good question.
And how might the financial landscape of that election, and perhaps even its outcome, have looked different if the rise of those powerful 527 organizations had not occurred following the passage of BCRA? Think about the enduring lessons from 2004 and how they might still inform our understanding of the role of money in political campaigns today. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.